Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Professor Chava Samuelson. I'm the Regents Professor of History and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, as well as the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. The Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State is committed to disseminating knowledge about Jews and Judaism through guest lectures, research conferences, adult education courses, and historical exhibits. Like everyone else, the COVID-19 pandemic has compelled us to conduct our activities via Zoom, at least since March 2020. While virtual activities are not as good as in-person activities, the technology has allowed us to reach a wide audience literally all over the world. In the previous semester, we held a research conference on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages. And then we had 3 lecture series, one on religion and science, one on thinking through literature after Auschwitz, and one on Jewish genealogy. We are very grateful to the support from our donors and our Friends of Jewish Studies for making these activities possible, and to the scholars who shared their knowledge with us. During this semester, we have a lecture series on the rabbis that shaped Jewish history. Actually, we're going to have one on Thursday in that series, which is taught by Professor Stanley Mervis. And we also have a forthcoming research conference on Judaism and public health, living in the shadows of pandemics. This evening, we are hosting Professor Pamela Nadell of American University as our Albert and Liese Eckstein Scholar in Residence in Jewish Studies. The Scholar in Residence program was established in 1989 by Paul and Flo Eckstein, and it was supported also by Diane and John Eckstein, who contributed to the endowment. Over the past 33 years, the program has brought to ASU and to the Jewish community in Phoenix numerous Judaica scholars who have explored Jewish history and culture. In the past 2 years, it was decided to focus the Eckstein Lecture on American Jewry. The Center for Jewish Studies is most grateful to the Eckstein family for the generosity and continued support and involvement with Jewish studies at ASU. To tell you a bit more about Albert and Liese Eckstein and the Eckstein Scholar in Residence, I invite Flo Eckstein, who has been the publisher of the Jewish News of Greater Phoenix from 1981 to 2013. Flo, please.
Thank you, Chava. I'm Flo Eckstein, and in behalf of my family, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 33rd Annual Eckstein Lecture hosted by ASU Jewish Studies. My in-laws, Albert and Liese Eckstein, founded this series in 1989 to share with our community the knowledge and wisdom of leading scholars. My husband and I, and my husband Paul's brother John, and my sister Diane are honored to continue to sustain this program. Diane and I married the Eckstein brothers, so we have been blessed to share not only our parents, but also our in-laws. We are dedicating this evening's lecture by leading feminist scholar Pamela Nadell to 2 outstanding Jewish women, our mother-in-law Liese and our mother Pearl Newmark. They ran their households and held professional jobs at a time it was less common to do so, and both worked alongside their husbands. Miraculously, both marriages survived that close working relationship. Our mother and mother-in-law showed us how to seamlessly weave Jewish values into the lives of our family and community. Thank you, Chava. Thank you, Judith Kaplan, and thank you, Don Beeson, Senior Coordinator for Jewish Studies, for making this evening possible.
Great. Thank you very much, Flo. And I'm now delighted to introduce our current Eckstein Scholar in Residence, Professor Pamela Nadell, who holds the Patrick Clendenen Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she also directs the Jewish Studies program. Professor Nadell holds her PhD from Ohio State University in American Jewish History from 1982, and her research focuses on the history of American Jewish women. Let me just give you 3 titles of her books. The first one that I will mention is Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985. The book came out in 1999, and obviously is of interest to all of us who wanted to know how women became rabbis. Another important book is Women and American Judaism, Historical Perspectives. That was done together with Jonathan Sarna. And the third and most recent book, American Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. It came out in 2019 and has received the Jewish Book Awards, Jewish Book of the Year. So, sorry, it has received the National Jewish Book Awards, Jewish Book of the Year. So the focus on American Jewish women is of particular interest to all of us, given the contribution of Jewish women to the women's movement. And in light of the challenges, the political challenges that the movement faces today. Appropriately, tonight's lecture will be on Jewish women and the feminist revolution. But let me tell you a little bit more about the awards of Pamela Nadell. She is the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. She's the recipient of the American Jewish Historical Society's Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service. She consults museums such as the National Museum of American Jewish History and the Library of Congress. And at American University, she received the university's highest award, Scholar Teacher of the Year. Currently, Professor Nadell is writing a book about the history of anti-Semitism in America. And she has already published essays on this very urgent and painful topic at the Washington Post and The Conversation. I'm going to turn off my camera and my audio so we can all listen to Professor Nadell. At the end of her presentation, we'll start with the discussion, perhaps first with a question from me, and then we'll turn to the audience. Please place your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Professor Nadell, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Samuelson, and thank you so much for that warm and generous introduction. I'm just delighted to be with you this evening. I obviously want to thank Professor Tirosh Samuelson for inviting me to be the Eckstein Scholar in Residence this year. I want to thank her staff, Liese Kaplan and Don Beeson, for their assistance. And I'm just sorry that the pandemic has prevented me from joining you in person. I also want to extend my appreciation to the entire Eckstein family for their generosity to ASU and for welcoming me so warmly. So let me start by sharing my screen. And there we go. And I want to begin by turning to the topic for this evening. So the opening quotation is from a woman named Bella Abzug. We're going to meet her in a moment. Down from our pedestal and up from the laundry room, Jewish women and the feminist revolution. And here we can see Bella Abzug climbing up the steps of the Capitol in January 1971. She was one of just 15 women in the United States Congress. The other 520 were men. In the feminist movement of her day, Representative Abzug was one of a striking cohort of Jewish women widely heralded as feminist icons. And you can see them here. Betty Friedan, author of the Feminine Mystique, Gloria Steinem, founder of Ms. Magazine, and Sally Priesand, the first American woman ordained a rabbi, who this year, by the way, is celebrating the 50th anniversary of her rabbinate. These and others appeared in my recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. But that survey, spanning more than 350 years, could just touch upon the myriad of Jewish women leading the feminist revolution. So I'm especially grateful that this evening, that this Eckstein Scholar in Residence lecture gives me the opportunity to share with you some of these feminist icons and also to think more deeply about what their leadership meant. Because I will argue this evening that the lineup of Jewish women in the forefront of the movement, challenging females' second-class status in all areas of American life, is simply astounding. It compels us to consider how and why they played such a disproportionate role in unleashing a revolution that reverberates down until this day. So before we can turn to the second wave of American feminism, obviously, we need to get to the first. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. Look, I'm not misquoting the American Declaration of Independence. You know it as well as I do. Of course, it never said all men and women are equal. Instead, I am quoting the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions adopted in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, an event widely heralded as launching the 19th century American women's rights movement. Now, this woman, the Polish Jewish immigrant Ernestine Potowski-Rose, was not at that meeting, but 3 years later, she spoke at another National Women's Rights Convention, and there she said, "It is high time to compel man by the might of right to give woman her political, legal, and social rights." In Poland, Ernestine Rose had refused the bridegroom her father chose and then sued her father to keep the inheritance her late mother had left her, which her father was planning to use as her dowry. In America, she became the first Jewish women's rights leader. Others, of course, would follow. The American 19th century women's rights movement poured most of its energies into winning the vote. But by the 19-teens, a new idea, feminism, had come into view. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried Google Ngram, but what this does is I put into Google Ngram the word feminism, and it searches across all the Google books how often that word was used. And you can see that it's before 1910, it's not even used. So when we talk about women's rights in the 19th century, we can't even use the word feminism, because feminism at one time referred to the qualities of being female, but now it takes on a new meaning, the promotion of equal rights for women, no matter where they found themselves in American life. And so you can see how the new notion of feminism begins to percolate, but it really, really takes off in the 60s from this slide. So it's a great tool, especially for the students on here. It's a great tool for research to have. So what happens with the word feminism is it begins to think that women's rights can mean different things to different groups of women. So for American Jews, its influence surfaced in various places and spaces. For example, in the Jewish-dominated garment industry, tens of thousands of sewing girls, braving club-wielding gangsters and the police, went out on strike against intolerable working conditions. In American synagogues in these years, the new ideas percolating led to the first widely heralded bat mitzvah. And we actually see, we don't have a photo from it, but the woman who was the first bat mitzvah when she was 12 years old was Judith Kaplan, and you can see her here. These are the years when Jewish women start becoming Hebrew school teachers. There are even a few women who dare to try to become rabbis. But outside the synagogue, tens of thousands of American Jewish women start banding together in large organizations that I call the powerhouse organizations of America's Jewish women. And many of them still exist today. They had different purposes. to sustain their branches of Judaism, to advance Zionism, to make women's voices heard in national and international affairs, but all were influenced, whether they acknowledged it or not, by the feminism of their moment and its calls for expanding women's opportunities. And here we can see Carrie Simon. She was the founder of the National Federation for Temple Sisterhoods. Today it's called the Women of Reform Judaism. And even before 1920, which was the year all American women got the right to vote, she actually published this statement: women's emancipation is no longer to be argued. It may be dreaded, deplored, or defied, but it is to be reckoned with. So national and international crises always end up pushing women's issues to the back burner. The urgency of the moment overpowers everything else, obliterating secondary concerns, and anything to do with women's rights is always considered a secondary concern. Policymakers are just convinced that women's rights, women's issues, they can just simply wait until the emergency has passed. So scholars call these years between 1929 and the 1950s the period of the doldrums. Feminist aims paled before the calamity of the Great Depression, the cataclysm of World War II, and the alarms of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. But it did not vanish. Its advocates carried it forward, and there were still women who were trying to push against the gendered boundaries, and they kept facing enormous resistance. One of them was in New York, named Helen Leventhal, and in 1939, she completed the entire rabbinical curriculum at the Jewish Institute of Religion. Today, the Jewish Institute of Religion is part of Hebrew Union College, but back then it was a separate school. And just like the men in her rabbinical class, she wrote a rabbinical thesis. Hers researched Jewish law to find out if it permitted women to vote. And she concluded that it did. And then she used that to advocate that in British Mandate Palestine, the Jewish Women's Equal Rights League was justified, was justified in demanding female suffrage in all national and local elections. But when graduation day rolled around, Helen Leventhal's classmates became rabbis. She was never ordained. Although World War II provided a brief interlude in women's advancement in American life, as the wartime economy and even the military commandeered women power to win the war, the feminist doldrums returned in the 1950s. Now, even more powerful voices like that newfangled, they were on the newfangled TV, in the days when there were only like 2 or 3 channels, shows like Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver. Those shows broadcast women's cheerful conformity to gender roles and domestic contentment. So for example, this image, which comes from the National Museum of American Jewish History, is an image of those years. Popular culture tells us Jewish mothers were really happy then. What were they doing? They were driving their sons to Little League, their daughters to Girl Scouts. They're driving all their children to Sunday school, and they drove themselves to Hadassah meetings. But even during the 1950s, some women began questioning the script of their lives. Those purportedly contented mothers pushing baby carriages in the spanking new suburbs had a lot of time to think. They thought, you got educated, you married, you had children. Was there nothing more to life? As their baby daughters became girls and then teens, some of them sensed their mother's disappointments, the careers thwarted by marriage and motherhood, the boredom, the despair. There and then they resolved not to let that happen to them. They were not the first daughters to dream of living lives different than their mothers, but they came of age at a time where there were opportunities to do so. A new feminist movement was about to burst out of those questions and discontents, and as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, some of those disgruntled mothers and their determined daughters would become its leaders. So the birth of second wave feminism really has its stirrings in these 1950s, believe it or not, and certainly in the early 1960s. At the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods that Carrie Simon had founded, Executive Director Jane Evans sensed that American women were stirring anew as a young John F. Kennedy established the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. Appointed to its Committee for Protective Labor Legislation was the veteran labor activist, Russian Jewish immigrant, Bessie Abramowitz Hillman. Now, Jane Evans, as executive director of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, decided if there was going to be an American commission studying the status of women, then why wouldn't the women of Reform Judaism also undertake their own study, but not of the status of American women, but rather of the paramount signifier of women's equality in their world of Reform Judaism, ordaining women rabbis. 2 years later, so 1963, both groups reported their findings. The Presidential Commission's report, called American Women, was no feminist statement. It reaffirmed women's proper roles as wives, mothers, and housekeepers. But it did document the inequities women faced in the workplace, and it included items that had long been on Bessie Hillman's agenda: paid maternity leave for working women and child care centers. Meanwhile, the women of Reform Judaism convened to celebrate their golden anniversary. 1,000 delegates voted overwhelmingly that it was high time that their movement of American Judaism should resolve once and for all the question of women rabbis. And by then, second wave feminism was bursting out in American life. In 1963, so the same year that the women of Reform Judaism called for women to become rabbis, housewife and journalist Betty Friedan, née Betty Goldstein, published The Feminine Mystique. There she chronicled the boredom, discontent, and dismay of her generation of female college graduates confined to suburban homes, which she denounced, and this will sound shocking today, but it didn't so much in 1963. She called those suburban homes comfortable concentration camps. Describing the malaise as the problem that has no name, Friedan blamed the media, social scientists, and others for propagating a feminine mystique, dictating to women that their only roles in life were to sublimate their own desires to nurture those of their husbands and children. Calling for an end to women's subordination in the home and the workplace, The Feminine Mystique became an instant classic and was translated into a dozen languages. By the way, Hebrew was not one of them. It still has never been translated. All of it has never been translated into Hebrew. But this book launched a revolution, and Friedan, who later linked her sensitivity to sexism to the exclusion she faced as a Jew growing up in the American Midwest, became the mother of second wave American feminism. So Congress now paved the way for women to act on their discontent. In 1963, it passed the Equal Pay Act. A year later, Congress enacted one of the most sweeping pieces of civil rights legislation in this nation's history. It outlawed racial discrimination in American life. No longer could water fountains be labeled whites and colored. No longer could restaurants refuse to serve African Americans. And then, unexpectedly, by the way, thanks to a Southern congressman who injected gender into the bill that became the law, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act made it unlawful for employers to discriminate in hiring on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. A year later, the government established the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission to enforce the law. The commission's staff, expecting to deal mostly with racial bias, was stunned when more than a third of the complaints filed in the first year were about sex discrimination. Was it still legal for employers to advertise help wanted male and help wanted female? Could states continue to protect women by barring them from certain jobs? Could airlines routinely fire stewardesses, as flight attendants were called then, when they reached the old age of 35? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission hired a female lawyer named Sonia Pressman. As a child, she had escaped Nazi Germany. As a lawyer looking for a job, she interviewed with a man who told her to apply to be his legal secretary. Now, this exasperated feminist, infuriated by how her bosses were belittling and ignoring the sex discrimination complaints, groused to Friedan, women need their own civil rights organization. In 1966, Friedan became the founding president of the National Organization for Women, established to demand equal rights for women. 12% of its founding members were Jews at a time when Jews were just 3% of the population of the United States. The birth of NOW, as the National Organization for Women came to be called, heralded the arrival of the new women's movement in American life. 4 years later, Friedan spearheaded the women's strike for equality. On August 26, 1970, 50 years after American women had won the right to vote, women around the nation rose up. They marched and protested in cities across America. In New York, they hoisted placards like these, reading, "Don't cook dinner tonight, starve a rat today," and "Repent, male chauvinists, your world is coming to an end." The throngs overflowed the one lane the parade was allotted on New York's Fifth Avenue, and then the crowd streamed into Bryant Park, which is behind the New York Public Library, to hear their leaders speak. There, Friedan claimed, "In the religion of my ancestors, there was a prayer that Jewish men said every morning. They prayed, 'Thank thee, Lord, that I was not born a woman.' Today I feel for the first time, feel absolutely sure that all women are going to be able to say, as I say tonight, 'Thank thee, Lord, that I was born a woman for this day.'" Nearly 15 years later, telling this story to a group of American and Israeli feminists meeting in Jerusalem, Friedan recalled that she was startled by her own words. She claimed that she had no idea that she even knew that prayer. At this defining moment of second wave feminism, she stood before the world as an American, a woman, a feminist, and a Jew. But by then, she was just one of the myriad of Jewish women in the forefront of second wave feminism as it wrought a revolution. So what was that revolution all about? Women won the right to keep their surnames when they married, and while married, to get financial credit on their own, which was something Bella Abzug championed. Jobs once routinely held by men were now open to women. Women flooded into the professions which until then had had only token female representation. In 1970, on the day that Newsweek magazine published this cover story, Women in Revolt, which was about the new feminist movement, 46 of its female employees revolted, filing a class action lawsuit charging the magazine with sex discrimination in hiring and promotion. One of those 46, Lynn Povich, had been the first girl in her synagogue to have a bat mitzvah. After a subsequent law prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program, universities had to offer their co-eds, not just their male students, athletic programs. By 1974, an entire new field of study had emerged, and more than 1,000 colleges were offering women's studies courses. The Supreme Court legalized abortion. Rape and the threat of rape became understood as demonstrations of male power, of how men dominate and humiliate women. Domestic violence and sexual harassment entered the lexicon. So did Ms., replacing Miss and Mrs. Feminists entered politics. They wrote literature and poetry. They made movies. They appeared on television. In 1 hour, I cannot possibly convey the breadth of those transformations. Within 2 decades, the political, legal, social, and cultural landscape of the United States underwent a seismic shift around gender issues. Although the term women's liberation is often used to refer to second-wave feminism, it is actually one of the 2 major streams of this activism. Friedan, advocating equal rights feminism, sought legislative and political change. The goals remained equality before the law, in life, and in opportunities. Women's liberation, by contrast, was its radical counterpart. Equality before the law was not enough. Instead, women's liberation homed in on the power struggles that exist between men and women everywhere, in the boardroom, the courtroom, the bedroom, and the kitchen. It insisted that history and society dictated gender roles, not biology. Women's liberation called for a complete restructuring of the relations between the sexes. Convinced that the personal is political, which became its slogan, that everything personal is impacted by the political, women's liberationists scrutinized everything that touched women's lives: relationships, marriage, children, the nuclear family, body image, sexuality, the medical system, work, and the workplace. The litany of Jewish names in the forefront of both equal rights feminism and women's liberation is dazzling. Because many of these names will be unfamiliar to you, I'm going to share now a tiny sample of some of the brightest Jewish feminist stars. Bella Abzug joined Friedan on the podium at the Women's Strike for Equality. As a child, she had been a member of a Zionist youth group. In the 1930s, when her father died, when she was just 13, she went to synagogue on her way to school for a year to say Kaddish, the memorial prayer for the dead. And of course, she was doing that in an Orthodox synagogue where she was saying it from behind the partition separating men and women. As a peace activist, she rode the crest of second-wave feminism into the House of Representatives, and you can see her campaign poster here. Journalist Gloria Steinem also spoke at the Women's Strike for Peace. Her father was Jewish, her mother was not. Both those who champion feminism and those who excoriate it have called her out as a Jew. In 1972, she launched the feminist magazine Ms. Its editor, Letty Cotton Pogrebin, had turned her back on Judaism as a teenager when, wanting to say Kaddish for her mother, she was excluded from the minyan, the quorum of 10 men needed for the memorial prayer. When she confronted anti-Semitism in the women's movement a decade later, so this is in the early 1980s, She exposed it in the pages of Ms. Magazine and the New York Times. Gerda Lerner had escaped Vienna after the Anschluss, the annexation by the Nazis of Austria. In America, in her 40s, she earned a doctorate in history, pioneered the new field of women's history, and lobbied the government to designate March Women's History Month. She also blamed the Hebrew Bible for centering patriarchy at the core of Western civilization. Growing up, Ruth Bader Ginsburg remembered seeing signs, "No dogs or Jews allowed." At Harvard Law School, the dean made her justify why she deserved a spot in the class that could have gone to a man. As director of the American Civil Liberties Union Women's Project, she argued landmark cases that overturned sex discrimination. In 1993, she became the second woman and the sixth Jew named to the US Supreme Court. When a 12-year-old girl had to quit her baseball team because the Little League Association barred girls from the diamond, Professor Judith Weiss convinced her National Organization for Women chapter to file a sex discrimination suit. When Judge Sylvia Pressler heard the case, she ruled, and I quote, "Even if whites like to be with whites, blacks like to be with blacks, and Jews like to be with Jews, we must start somewhere in reversing the trends in this society. The sooner that little boys realize that girls are equal, the better." 2 Jewish women had opened the nation's favorite pastime to the girls of America. As a child, Marilyn Saltzman was shocked when a Little League coach told her, "You can't try out, you're a girl." In January 1969, at a counter-inauguration rally held the day before Richard Nixon was sworn in as president, she and Shulamith Firestone, who had attended an Orthodox yeshiva, stepped up to the microphone to speak about women's equality. They expected their anti-war, new left, male friends to embrace their cause. Instead, those comrades in arms shouted, "Take them off the stage," and raped them. Traumatized, they broke with the new left and helped launch women's liberation. Many of these Jewish feminists wrote their rage onto the page in articles and books that became classics of women's liberation. Alex Kate Schulman's A Marriage Agreement created a contract for a husband and wife to split all household tasks 50-50, from waking the kids in the morning to wife strips beds, husband remakes them. Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape defined rape not as a crime of lust, but as a crime of violence, and made the startling observation that the threat of rape enabled all men to keep all women in a perpetual state of fear. For many feminists like Robin Morgan, Jewish descent then seemed irrelevant. Morgan helped plan one of the iconic events of the women's liberation movement, the demonstration at the 1968 Miss America beauty pageant, where protesters trashed implements of female torture, like false eyelashes and high heels. They never burned a bra, but from that day forward, feminists were called bra burners. Another group of activists, 3/4 of them Jews, organized the Boston Women's Health Book Collective to challenge the medical establishment's patronizing treatment of women. In 1973, they published Our Bodies, Ourselves, a book that has since sold millions of copies in multiple languages around the world. As a child, Heather Booth wanted to be a rabbi, but of course women could not be rabbis back then. In 1965, after she helped a friend arrange for an illegal abortion, she founded Jane, a clandestine referral service that helped over 10,000 women find safe abortionists until abortion became legal in the US in 1973. So this introduces just a few of the Jewish leaders of second wave feminism American style. So I want to ask a bunch of questions. I want to know, first of all, why so many of them were attracted to the cause. These women leapt into feminism because of the convergence of their unique experiences as women, Jews, and Americans. Jewish women faced triple discrimination as women, as Jews, and as Jewish women. As girls and women, they had met men like the law school dean who had demanded that Ruth Bader Ginsburg justify why she deserved a spot in the class that could have gone to a man. And I hope you can see where she is in this photo to get a sense of what it was like to be a member of that class. As Jews, they had coped with prejudice from Gentiles. Friedan traced the origins of her feminism to her high school experiences of anti-Semitism. All her girlfriends were invited to join sororities, but because she was Jewish, she was not. That rejection isolated her. She felt marginalized, standing outside the dominant culture, looking in. It fueled her passion against injustice, and she repeated this story so often that it appeared in her New York Times obituary. Basically, for her, exclusion as a Jew was the leap. It was the impetus that led her to realize the oppression she was enduring as a woman. But Jewish women also encountered chauvinism within American Jewish life. Even a purported advance, like the proliferation of bat mitzvah, which by 1960 was permitted in many conservative Reform synagogues, was carefully curbed. Lynn Povich, let's just see if that's back there. Okay, wait. Okay, sorry about that. Lynn Povich celebrated that she was the first girl to have a bat mitzvah in her synagogue, but that meant that she knew that generations of women before her had not had one. Pogrebin was propelled to feminism by her exclusion from her mother's mourner's minyan. Friedan upended a prayer that men had prayed, thanking God for not making them a woman. Yet Judaism could have a paradoxical effect, driving others into the feminist movement. In the 1960s, the traditional teaching of Tikkun Olam was reformulated as demanding social justice. Tikkun Olam simply means to repair the world. And it became a powerful expression of American Judaism. For many American Jews, being Jewish came to mean standing up against all forms of discrimination. And so here we see Heather Booth playing the guitar during Freedom Summer, the civil rights activism of the 1960s. So some of these, and we'll go here, some of these women looked to activist Jewish women before them. They remembered the pioneering founders of the Jewish women's organizations. They recalled grandmothers and mothers who had been labor activists, whose politics of the left had raged against prejudice and equality. They knew that these women had campaigned for birth control, for peace, for consumer rights, for Zionism, for civil rights, for nuclear disarmament. So even if the Jewish women marching in the forefront of second wave feminism did not fully comprehend the breadth of this history, and I don't think they did, they sensed that they stood in a long line of Jewish female activists. So we can understand why Jewish women were drawn to feminism, but the question is, why were they so disproportionately represented in its leadership? Here, family background, education, and social class provide clues. Having grown up arguing politics at the dinner table in leftist homes, they felt empowered to break the stereotype of nice, quiet girls and raise their voices. Perhaps there was also something distinctive about Jewish women's rage against sexism, a rage augmented by the dread of turning into their bored suburban mothers if they did not strike out in new directions. Moreover, American Jews had long prized education as the path to success. Daughters as well as sons went to college. Across much of the 20th century and down until today, a significantly higher percentage of American Jewish women than of American women have spent time in college and graduate school. College polishes skills useful to political movements, how to hone an argument, debate, and write. No wonder Jewish women's names stand out on the bookshelf of feminist classics. Finally, Jewish women had joined in disproportionate numbers the civil rights and New Left activists. Striving to end other oppressions, they realized their own. And they had learned how to organize. They came to the feminist movement knowing what tactics could disrupt the status quo, how to plan a protest, occupy an office, get the attention of the press, and also operate a mimeograph machine. No wonder so many Jewish women stepped into leadership. Yet, except for Friedan's remarkable speech at Women's Strike for Equality, feminist leaders who came from Jewish backgrounds, by and large, ignored their Jewishness in the early years. For some, whose religion was progressive politics, radical causes, human rights, Jewish identity was too particular. In essence, gender trumped all other aspects of identity. But later, after anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism exploded in the international women's movement, some of these feminist leaders came to acknowledge their Jewishness. The United Nations had declared the decade between 1975 and 1985 the International Women's Decade. It convened 3 global conferences. The first, in Mexico City, denounced Zionism as racism months before the United Nations General Assembly did. Others saw outrageous outbursts of anti-Semitism and attacks on Israeli feminists. When in Mexico City, Leah Rabin, wife of the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, got up to speak, Arabs, communists, and many other delegates stormed out. Friedan, leading the American delegation, was so incensed that she marched up to the podium to shake Rabin's hand. By that time, Friedan and the other second-wave feminist leaders had to concede the magnitude of Jewish particularity. And they encountered an American Jewish community and Judaism that had also been having its own feminist awakenings. So I just want to take, like, in the last few minutes that I have, I want to talk very, very briefly, because I don't have enough time, both about feminist Judaism and Israel. So what I can say in the limited time that I have is that feminists, infuriated by the sexism of Jewish tradition, began calling for an end to the second-class status of women in Jewish religious life and Jewish communal life. Their demands calling for change, including the ordination of women as rabbis, sparked enormous changes in American Reform and conservative synagogues, and eventually spilled over to Orthodox Judaism too. Aspects of that awakening led to ritual and liturgical innovations, the expansion of Jewish women's studies, the founding of lesbian and gay synagogues, and transformations beyond the synagogue. And so I just want to show you 2 images. This is what Judaism used to look like in most synagogues. Maybe many of you have been in synagogues that have these photos hanging on the walls. If you look very closely at the young woman sitting to the left of the rabbi as you look, so to the right of the rabbi, but to our left, that is Ruth Bader at her confirmation. I like to say it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg at her confirmation and not at her confirmation hearings. And this is what Judaism has come to look like in many places today. But what was going on in Israel? Because many of these American feminists played a role in exporting feminism, American style, to Israel. So in the early 20th century, as feminism surged around the world, new nationalist movements began lofting its banner. And here you see the very, the kind of common image of the pioneers also training the women in military self-defense. So signs of women's equality actually seem to be everywhere in those years. The female pioneers in the kibbutzim, the collective colonies in the pre-state Israel, compulsory military service for women, an equal rights for women law. But pretty soon, journalists and scholars exposed the lies behind those ideas. What did women do in the army? They were shunted into female secretarial jobs. Was there really an equal rights law? Was it really effective? Well, David Ben-Gurion had made an agreement with the Orthodox parties that women saw as a case of socialist men compromising with Orthodox men to sell out Jewish women because it let the Orthodox control issues of personal status. What did female pioneers really do on the kibbutzim, on the collectives? They spent 16 hours a day washing shirts and peeling vegetables. So feminism, American style, began to move into Israel. And it came from American Jewish women who moved there, from immigrants, from American Jewish women who were visiting, and from Israeli women who had been exposed to American feminism while they were visiting the United States. In the summer of 1984, an organization called the American Jewish Congress convened its annual America-Israel Dialogue in Jerusalem. Its topic was Woman is Jew, Jew is Woman, an Urgent Inquiry. The American delegation was headed by Betty Friedan, and the women who had been in the forefront of developing feminism in America reached out to Israeli women and found that there was a feminist groundswell. Crowds clamored for admission to the meetings. In her keynote address, Friedan told the story about how that prayer had just burst out at her, the women's strike for equality. And Friedan said, Israeli women did not have to follow what American women were doing, but they had a lot of work to do to transform the personal into the political. That meeting catalyzed the founding of the Israel Women's Network to press the chief institutions of the nation, the government, the Israel Defense Forces, and the economic sector to advance women's status in Israel. 4 years later, the first international Jewish feminist conference on the empowerment of women convened in Jerusalem. More than 1,000 Jewish women from more than 20 countries showed up. Bella Abzug gave the opening speech. She remarked it was high time for a woman to become president of the United States. And then she said, and I quote, she could hardly do worse than the men have done. But it was an event outside the conference hall that still roils Israel 3 decades later. On the morning of December 1st, carrying a Torah and a small folding table for the reading, 70 women, some wearing the male prayer shawl, went to pray at the Western Wall, Judaism's most holy site. Many were Americans. The service began peacefully, but when the women unrolled the Torah, other women began screaming at them, and ultra-Orthodox men climbed onto chairs to stare over the partition separating men and women at that site and began shouting obscenities. The women managed to finish their prayer and their service, and they left the plaza singing a prayer for peace. They had made history. Since then, women have tried, and more often than not, failed to pray at the Western Wall with the Torah scrolls. The ongoing clash there attests once again to the powerful influence of feminism, American style, that it has had on Israel. So I'm going to sum up. So historians, what we like to do is we rest our arguments on facts, obviously. But lately, some have toyed with the what-ifs of what we call counterfactual history. What if the Romans had not destroyed the temple? What if Spain had not expelled the Jews in 1492? So I'm going to ask some what-ifs. What if Jewish women had not funneled into the American women's movement in the 1960s? Would someone else have exposed the Feminine Mystique? Would another lawyer have taken the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to task? Would a magazine other than Ms. have become a major voice of the movement? Would there be a federally recognized Women's History Month? Would others have revolutionized our understandings of domestic violence and rape as crimes of power? Would women have become rabbis? Would there be an Israel Women's Network? No one knows those answers. But this litany of questions attests to the remarkable impact of American Jewish women on the feminist movements in the United States and in Israel, no matter whether they define themselves as secular or religious, Reform, conservative, or Orthodox, leftist or universalist. Women who emerged from Jewish cultural milieus crafted a feminism informed, whether they acknowledged it or not only by their experiences of female oppression, but also out of their Jewish past. Thank you. So we're ready for questions.
Do you want me to ask the questions, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Or well, Chava, did you want to start with a question? I guess I can actually open the queue.
All right, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I think I'm not allowed to open my. You have to
Yes,
make it possible.
No, Chava, you're there. Just put your camera on. We can
No,
see
it doesn't open for some reason. It's
Oh, do you want to ask the question? Do you want to ask the question?
yeah,
or
I
you want me
I can ask the question kind of. I'm glad that you ended the way you did. I would like to problematize it a little bit. If and it's kind of you know, there's a reason for the question. How has feminism, in your view, enriched Jewish religious life on the one hand, and how has feminism contributed to the secularization of Jewish life on the other hand? If
Yeah.
you can,
So
tension.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that the secularization of Jewish life has been ongoing since the first Jews came to America in 1654. So that we shouldn't only think that acculturation, secularization, assimilation is a 21st century issue. So that's the first point. The reality, in my opinion, is that feminism dramatically infused American Jewish life, because for the first time ever, half of the population that had been disenfranchised now became fully citizens of their communities and their synagogues. So, for example, in the 1950s, the conservative movement made a decision that at the bar mitzvah of her son, a mother could have an aliyah. And as it was having bat mitzvah, that girls could have an aliyah. And it never imagined that at some point in the future, those girls who had a bat mitzvah or their mothers might ever think that they should ever have another aliyah. So all of a sudden, and that's that image I gave you, which is, you know, in bright color, of the women who are engaged with Torah in a way that they had never, ever had the opportunity to be. And the important thing to understand is this is not only a development of Reform and conservative Judaism, because Orthodox Judaism, centrist Orthodox Judaism, modern Orthodox Judaism has begun ordaining women. They go by different titles. There are a few that take the title Rabbi. They go by Rabbah, Rabbinate. But Maharat was one of the innovations. But their Judaism is open to so many more people, access to leadership, access to learning. Think about the tradition of how Orthodox boys used to go to seminary after high school for a year, and then they would come back and they would go to college. But now Orthodox girls do that as well. So feminism has dramatically transformed all sectors of Jewish religious life. And maybe it has, maybe you're thinking it's chased some people away from Judaism. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's open it up to questions from the Q&A. Can you see the questions and read them out?
Yeah, I can.
You can do that? Okay.
Yeah, sure. So, so we'll start with David Kadar. To what extent does this emancipation and liberation of women in general in the U.S., with Jewish women beneficiaries of this history as well and in leadership roles, lead Jewish women in both leadership and in the Jewish female population to assimilate in great numbers and secularize. So that's very similar to Professor Samuelson's question. I think one of the things that we need to reckon with, and historians of American Judaism are really paying a lot of attention to this now. I can name several books. Rachel Gross's new book about Jewish culture in America is that American Jews are Jewish in many ways that are not, that they're religiously Jewish in many ways that we have not necessarily classified, because we've been classifying being religious as either being observant in terms of Jewish law or of being a participant in a synagogue. And just to give you an example, she has a whole chapter on how engaging with Jewish delis is actually an expression of Jewish nostalgia, an expression of Jewish culture. And if we expand our definition of what it means to be religious, we will see that engaging in Jewish delis or visiting a Jewish synagogue museum is also part of Jewish identity. So I'm influenced by that scholarship in a really serious way. Linda Shivers asked, has Ms. Magazine become anti-Semitic? I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't really followed Ms. in recent years. But there was when Letty Cotton Pogrebin exposed anti-Semitism in Ms. Magazine in, I think, the early 1980s, the response to that article got more letters than any other article they had ever written. And there was a lot of discontent that most of the letters that they ended up publishing were actually very critical of what she had to say. It's been said that Jewish women were early beneficiaries of Title IX in academia and securing professional posts in universities. Could you comment? So I think you mean Title VII, because Title IX, no, maybe no, I guess no, Title IX also about discrimination in any federally funded institution. So can I comment? Yeah, I'm going to comment personally. When I got hired at American University a very long time ago, I knew that they had interviewed 2 men and 2 women. Would they have interviewed 2 women before Title IX? I don't know. But I do know that the great sociologist, Nathan Glazer, I think he once quipped this. I don't think he ever published it, but I heard it via somebody who heard it from him. He said that when the women's rights movement came forward and the federal legislation changed, the first beneficiaries and the greatest beneficiaries of these new laws were going to be Jewish women, because they were the educated ones and they were going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that were being opened. So I do agree with you. Okay. Another comment from David Cater. Where did that go? I asked for the understandable emphasis on bat mitzvah and rabbinic orientation may mislead on the overall general impact on the history of Judaism. Yeah, I understand that. Okay, so let's see. Holly Baum. Thank you for this historical survey. Curious if your research uncovered to what extent non-Ashkenazi Jewish women, Sephardic women, Jewish women of color, Jewish women from non-Western cultures, and non-college educated Jewish women were involved in the women's liberation feminist movement. Did I address these distinctions? I do talk about Jewish women who are descended from Sephardim. In my book, I actually opened with Grace Nathan, who was a colonial Jewish wife and mother, and Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem in the base of the Statue of Liberty, welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, coming to America. Neither were feminists, but they were actually great-grandmother and great-granddaughter. They were in one family. And I definitely certainly talked about Sephardic Jewish women. I did not talk a great deal about Jewish women of color. They get mentioned briefly at the end of the book. And some of that has to do with that I finished that manuscript in 2018. the conversation that we've been having about opening our eyes to see Jewish women to see Jews of color, all Jews of color, is really a much more recent conversation. And so it's not that I was blind to it, but it just did not get a lot of attention. How pervasive is anti-Semitism in national or international women's movements? Unfortunately, today, anti-Semitism is quite pervasive, and it remains pervasive because of the politics around the state of Israel. So some of you may remember that in Chicago during a march a couple of summers ago, Jewish women who were carrying a rainbow pride flag that had a Star of David on it were asked to leave the march, that they were told the marchers felt that this symbol was threatening. And this has been a very, very problematic issue, and not only in the women's movement. This is a problematic issue across most progressive social activist movements, that Jews who identify with the state of Israel, who support the existence of the state of Israel, find that they need to check their Zionism or their pro-Israelism at the door if they want to participate in these political movements. And it's become a real problem, especially for my students. I'm sure the students at ASU may find the same problem, that anti-Israelism has really become the new anti-Semitism. I'm not saying all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. That's not the case. There are, many people feel free to criticize various policies, but when a group denies the right of Israel as a state to exist, when it is convinced that Israel is anathema because it's a colonial settler state, that veers into classic anti-Semitic tropes. And people who want to be involved in leftist movements or progressive movements find that they have a great deal of trouble around that, because the majority of American Jews continue to support the existence of the state of Israel. So I'm not sure how we're doing on timing.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Those questions.
Okay, what do I see as the similarities and differences between the anti-Semitism in second wave feminism and the anti-Semitism in the feminist movement now? It's interesting. The anti-Semitism in second wave feminism was really virulently kind of classic anti-Semitic tropes. At one of the UN conferences, people heard things like the fact that Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug are leaders in this movement gives the entire American women's movement a bad name. It was really classic anti-Judaism. Whereas now the anti-Semitism in the feminist movement, like I just said, really tries to separate itself, kind of says, we're not anti-Semitic, we're only anti-Israel. In Orthodoxy, one of the questions is, in Orthodoxy, this comes from Gloria Bella Ballin, can a woman rabbi have a congregation, and who would be her congregants? So the answer is yes. Today in the United States and also in the state of Israel, women have been, as I said, have been ordained, and they are leading in congregations. I don't know if they are leading as solo, but they are also seen as religious officiants, religious functionaries in their congregations. We have a Maharat in one of the congregations in Washington, D.C., at Avi Weiss's synagogue in Riverdale in the Bronx. The first woman ordained, Rabbi Sarah Horowitz, has long been a member of the clergy at the congregation. So who would be her congregants? Modern Orthodox Jews, centrist Orthodox Jews don't seem to have a problem with this. And the stunning thing about this is that Blue Greenberg, the mother of Orthodox feminism, in 1983 predicted what was going to happen. She wrote an article called Will There Be Orthodox Women Rabbis? And in it, she recognized the advanced rabbinical educations Orthodox girls and women were starting to get in the 80s. So, you know, in the old days, if you went to a modern Orthodox yeshiva, when the boys went to study Talmud, the girls went to study, you know, the duties of being a good Jewish wife and mother, or maybe home ec. And now they were studying Talmud. And she recognized that one day there would be young women who had learned so much of the rabbinical curriculum that there would be very brave rabbis who would ordain them. And that has happened both in the United States, starting with Avi Weiss, and in the state of Israel. Among them, Rabbi Daniel Sperber is one of those who ordain women. So Roseanne Selfin asks, without the women of Reform Judaism and Jane Evans, do I believe the ordination of women in the rabbinate would have taken place when Sally Priesand was ordained? So you have to remember that in 1963, the women of Reform Judaism called for ordaining a woman rabbi, and Rabbi Priesand was ordained in 1972. I certainly believe that the women of Reform Judaism and Jane Evans were very powerful forces for her ordination, but I also know about the wider context. And there was a sea change in American life between 1963 and 1972. The media, day in and day out, was reporting on how women were advancing in American life. And by 1972, when Sally Priesand was the last of a long line of women who had wanted to be rabbis but had never managed to do so, I think Reform Judaism, I think the seminary would have felt that it was just too far out of step with American life to withhold her ordination. So there's, I see lots more questions. Can you just give me a sense of how many more you want me to take?
We can go until 8:30.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. All right. Sure. Then I'm happy to keep taking questions. So which feminists do you credit for leading the civil rights movement? That's a good question. There's a very important book called Going South. Its author, Deborah Schultz, interviewed about maybe 18 Jewish women who were involved in the civil rights movement. You probably won't recognize the names of too many, although I did see somebody post earlier about the founder of the Feminist Press, who was one of the women who was involved in the civil rights movement. The one name you might recognize was Rita Schwerner. Her husband, Mickey Schwerner, was one of the 3 civil rights workers that were murdered. Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney were murdered, and it took in Mississippi, and it took years and years for the murderers to be convicted of what they had done. So that would be one name that you would recognize, but I don't think you would know others. Well, thank you all for these lovely, really lovely comments about my zooming through a century of Jewish women's history. And what do I predict the role of buildings and synagogues will become? So, the great thing about the American Jewish community, my friend Jonathan Sarna has written about this, and it's that American Jews are always worried that they're going to be the last generation of American Jews, that it's just going to die out after us. And the astonishing thing about American Jewish history and American Jewish women's history is that American Jews keep reinventing what it means to be a Jew in America, what it means to be a Jew today. To give you an example, Professor Samuelson and I are the beneficiaries of the creation of Jewish studies programs that really only got off the ground in the 1960s and the 1970s. As of 1950, there were a total of 2 professors in the United States teaching Jewish studies. Yeah, there were rabbis who offered a course here and there, the Hillel rabbis. But look at what American Jews created. Look at what you created at ASU. And again, I'm so grateful to the Ecksteins for their support, that the American Jewish community recognized that Jewish studies needed to be part of the university curriculum. And this is a Jewish communal project. It doesn't mean that it's for about Jewish identity, but it has expanded the ways in which American Jews interact in American life. So what do I think about buildings and synagogues? The scholar Alana Cooper at Case Western University is doing very important work on what happens when synagogue buildings get abandoned, what happens to their objects. And we know that there's certainly been a shrinkage in the number of synagogue buildings, and we know that many synagogues have blended with other synagogues or sold their buildings and are looking for new models. But I also see that what have been some of those new models of recent years, the non-synagogue institutions, like in Washington, D.C., we call it Sixth and I, Hadar, the various fellowships, the various kahilot, that don't have buildings, but they're really, really powerful communities. So I think there'll be change, and that's good. I think change is really good, because if we don't change, we will lose the next generation. So let's see what else I see. What influence, Paul Eckstein's asked, what influence have women rabbis had on the rabbinate? They have had a tremendous influence on the rabbinate. First of all, when in 1889, Mary M. Cohen, back in the 1880s, Jewish women were actually named Mary. Mary M. Cohen wrote on the front page of the Jewish Exponent an article calling for women to become rabbis. She and others began to voice that women would bring a different point of view, a different perspective to the rabbinate. Remember that rabbis' wives still do, but also used to play very powerful roles right alongside their husbands, especially helping the women of the communities, the women of their congregations. So I think women ended up opening the rabbinate to be more relational. At least they've argued they've done that. They criticized the kind of model of the rabbi in the large congregation as the CEO of the congregation. They fought for things like maternity leave in the rabbinate, which then also led to paternity leave. So they definitely had a significant impact on changing the kind of male-centric model that we had for the rabbinate. And in so doing, they opened the rabbinate for new models for the rabbinate for men as well. So I think they've had a really significant impact. Years ago, I wrote a few articles about this with a very important sociologist named Rita Simon. Somebody asked, were there any prominent Jewish women in the anti-feminist movement? That's interesting. I'm guessing there were, and I haven't gone looking for them, is probably what I should say. But I imagine there have to be. Jews are not monolithic. American Jews have lots of different opinions about everything. Who are the Jewish women today who are equals of Pogrebin, Abzug, and Steinem? What names come to your mind? That's harder. I have to think about that. I mean, I think in terms of names coming to my mind, what jumps out at me is someone like Shuli Reuben Schwartz, who became chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I mean, this goes back to the question about, changes in the rabbinate. I don't think when Amy Eilberg was ordained a rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1985, anyone could ever possibly have envisioned that one day a female scholar would be the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So I certainly think that's a name that comes to my mind. I think of some of the many scholars who are doing really important work on Jews of color, and on greater diversity in the American Jewish community. There were some very important organizations there. But I don't think any of the names, first of all, they're kind of escaping my mind at the moment because I'm on the East Coast. So I'm on East Coast time, but I don't think you would be familiar with the names yet. How do I deal with the accusation from Black women that the second wave was racist or only concerned middle-class white women? I'm not saying it was true, but I've heard it often. You're absolutely right. Betty Friedan, the feminists who were striving for equal rights feminism were often absolutely blind to the difficulties that women of color faced. They were really concerned with careerism. They were really concerned with dismantling the legal barriers to women's equality. And I think, honestly, to give them credit, I think they assumed that once barriers to legal equality fell, as it should have fallen completely with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I think they assumed that African American men and women would no longer suffer from racial discrimination. And they were blind about that because, as we know, this remains a terrible problem in this country. So I too know about the critique, but it was just not what they were focused on back then. Okay. Someone asked about gender distribution of pulpit rabbis in the US. Is it a feminizing job niche? I don't know. Certainly there have been years of classes at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and also at Hebrew Union College that have had more women than men. I will say that when Sally Priesand was ordained, a professor, Norman Mirsky at Hebrew Union College, oh, somebody's laughing, knows him, I guess. He thought that the rabbinate would become feminized, but
sorry, it's Lisa. He was one. He was one of my professors.
Oh, okay, that's great. That's so great. Yeah. And no, he actually wrote a whole chapter about how it was become feminized. Have pay scales followed the growth of women rabbis? There continues to be a pay lag, as there continues to be a pay lag for women in all professions. I literally just heard that a female surgeon across her lifetime should expect to make $500,000 less than a male surgeon. And the only reason I know that is because my daughter's going to be a surgeon. Okay, do I think, all right, Holly Baum, do I think the role Jews play as outsiders in general in US culture is one of the reasons Jewish women may have been uniquely positioned to challenge the status quo? Yes, Holly, exactly. It is exactly what drove Betty Friedan. It is that they are, as I tried to convey in those remarks, Jewish women are triple marginalized. They're marginalized as women, they're marginalized as Jews, and then sometimes in their synagogue, they're marginalized as Jewish women. And it's that triple outsider status combined with all that education. Look, we're talking at a university tonight, right? I am convinced that universities do tremendous work in educating our population, but when you have that education behind you and you have the language to articulate what it means to be outside, what it means to be other, that allows for challenging the status quo. Okay, so Chava, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right, so this has been absolutely fascinating, so rich and so detailed and so flawlessly presented. So we are very grateful to you, Pamela, for doing all this. And I'm also very grateful to our wonderful audience that asked those penetrating questions. I would like to remind you that on Thursday, we have another, actually the second of our series on the rabbis. This time, Professor Mirvis is going to focus on the rabbis of the Middle Ages. That's a 7 o'clock event. And I hope to see you, all of you. So thank you all for joining us. And thanks the Eckstein family for this wonderful Eckstein Scholar in Residence program that has been done for so many years. And I look forward to seeing all of you in future events and public programs of Jewish studies. So good night and thanks.